Hello, my dears. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now, today we are continuing our readings of the different witches and fairy doctors section within fairy and folk tales of Irish origin. Now, I do ask that you let me know if there are any audio issues or if you are having any trouble hearing anything. But without much further ado, let us begin our first story of today. And today it is The Brown Bear of Norway, attributed to Patrick Kennedy. There was once a king in Ireland, and he had 3 daughters, and very nice princesses they were. And one day, that their father and themselves were walking in the lawn, the king began to joke with them, and to ask them who they would like to be married to. "I'll have the King of Ulster for a husband." Goodness, says one. "And I'll have the King of Munster," says another. "And," says the youngest, "I'll have no husband but the Brown Bear of Norway." For a nurse of hers used to be telling her of an enchanted prince that she called by that name, and she fell in love with him, and his name was the first name on her lips. And the very night before she was dreaming of him. Well, one laughed, and another laughed, and they all joked on the princess all the rest of the evening. But that very night she woke up out of her sleep, and in a great hall was lighted up with 1,000 lamps. The richest carpets were on the floor, and the walls were covered with cloth of gold and silver. And the place was full of grand company. And the very beautiful prince she saw in her dreams was there, and it wasn't a moment till he was on one knee before her, and telling her how much he loved her, and asking her wouldn't she be his queen? Well, she hadn't the heart to refuse him, and married they were the same evening. "Now, my darling," says he, when they were left by themselves, "you must know that I am under enchantment. A sorceress that had a beautiful daughter wished me for her son-in-law, and because I didn't keep the young girl at the distance I ought, the mother got power over me. And when I refused to marry her daughter, she made me take the form of a bear by day, and I was to continue so till a lady would marry me of her own free will, and endure 5 years of great trials after." "Of course, Raven Moon, I'll be able to do that after the stream." Well, when the princess woke in the morning, she missed her husband from her side, and spent the day very sorrowful. But as soon as the lamps were lighted in the great hall, where she was sitting on a sofa covered with silk, the folding doors flew open, and he was sitting by her side the next minute. So they spent another evening so happy, and he took an opportunity of warning her that whenever she began to tire of him, or not to have any confidence in him, they would be parted forever, and he would be obliged to marry the witch's daughter. So she got used to find him absent by day, and they spent a happy 12 months together, and at last a beautiful baby boy was born. And as happy as she was before, she was twice as happy now, for she had her child to keep her company in the day when she couldn't see her husband. At last, one evening, when herself and himself and her child were sitting with the window open because it was a sultry night, in flew an eagle, took the infant's sash in his beak, and up in the air with him. She screamed and was going to throw herself out the window after him, but the prince caught her and looked at her very seriously. She bethought of what he had said soon after their marriage, and stopped the cries and complaints that were on her lips. She spent her days very lonely for another 12 months, when a beautiful little girl was sent to her. Then she thought to herself she'd have a sharp eye about her this time, so she would never allow a window to be more than a few inches open. But all her care was in vain. Another evening, when they were all so happy, and the prince dangling the baby, a beautiful greyhound stood before them, took the child out of the father's hand, and was out the door before you could wink. This time she shouted, and ran out of the room, but there were some of the servants in the next room, and all declared that neither child nor dog passed out. She felt she could not tell how to her husband, but she kept command over herself, and didn't once reproach him. When the third child was born, she would hardly allow a window or a door to be left open for a moment, but she wasn't the nearer to keep the child to herself. They were sitting one evening by the fire, when a lady appeared standing by them. She opened her eyes in great fright and stared at her, and while she was doing so, the appearance wrapped a shawl round the baby that was sitting in its father's lap, and either sunk through the ground with it, or went through the wide chimney. This time the mother kept her bed for a month. "My dear," said she to her husband when she was beginning to recover, "I think I'd feel better if I was after seeing my father, my mother, and sisters once more. If you give me leave to go home for a few days, I'll be glad." "Very well," said he, "I will do that, and whenever you feel inclined to return, only mention your wish when you lie down at night." The next morning, when she awoke, she found herself in her old chamber in her father's palace. She rung the bell, and in a short time she had her mother and father and married sisters about her, and they laughed till they cried for joy at finding her safe back again. So in time she told them all that happened to her, and they didn't know what to advise her to do. She was as fond of her husband as ever, and she was sure that he couldn't help letting the children go. But she still was afraid beyond the world to have another child torn from her. Well, the mother and the sisters consulted a wise woman that used to bring eggs to the castle, for they had great confidence in her wisdom. She said the only plan was to secure the bear's skin that the prince was obliged to put on every morning and get it burned. And then he couldn't help being a man night and day, and then the enchantment would be put at an end. So they all persuaded her to do that, and she promised she would. And after 8 days, she felt so great a longing to see her husband again, that she made the wish the same night. And when she woke 3 hours after, she was in her husband's palace, and himself was watching over her. There was great joy on both sides. They were happy for many days. Now she began to reflect on how she never felt her husband leaving her of a morning, and how she never found him neglecting to give her a sweet drink out of a gold cup just as she was going to bed. So one night she contrived not to drink any of it, though she pretended to do so. And she was wakeful enough in the morning and saw her husband passing out through a panel in the wainscot, though she kept her eyes nearly closed. The next night, when she got a few drops of the sleepy posset that she had saved the evening before, she put it into her husband's night drink, and that made him sleep sound enough. She got up after midnight, passed through the panel, and found a beautiful brown bear's hide hanging in the alcove. She stole it back and went down to the parlor fire and put the hide into the middle of it, and never took eyes off of it till it was all fine ashes. She then lay down by her husband, gave him a kiss on the cheek, and fell asleep. If she was to live 100 years, never she'd forget how she wakened the next morning and found her husband looking down on her with misery and anger in his face. "Unhappy woman," said he, "you have separated us forever. Why hadn't you the patience for 5 years? I am now obligated, whether I like it or not, to go a 3 days' journey to the witch's castle and live with her daughter. The skin that was my guard, you have burned it, and the egg wife that gave you counsel was the witch herself. I won't reproach you, Your punishment will be severe enough without it. Farewell forever." He kissed her for the last time and was off the next minute, walking as fast as he could. She shouted after him, and then seeing there was no use, she dressed herself and pursued him. He never stopped, never stayed, nor looked back, and still she kept him in sight. And when he was on the hill, she was in the hollow, and when he was in the hollow, she was on the hill. Her life was almost leaving her, when just as the sun was setting, he turned up a lane and went into a little house. She crawled up after him, and when she got in there was a beautiful little boy on his knee, and he kissing and hugging him. "Here, my poor darling," says he, "is your eldest child, and there," says he, pointing to a nice middle-aged woman that was looking on with a smile on her face, "is the eagle that carried him away." She forgot all her sorrows in a moment, hugging her child and laughing and crying over him. The Vanthe washed their feet and rubbed them with an ointment that took all the sores away out of their bones, and made them as fresh as a daisy. The next morning, just before sunrise, he was up and prepared to be off. "Here," said he to her, "is a thing which may be of use to you. It's a scissors, and whatever stuff you cut with it will be turned into a rich silk. The moment the sun rises, I'll lose all memory of yourself and the children, but I'll get it at sunset again. Farewell." But he wasn't gone far till she was in sight of him again, leaving her boy behind. It was the same today as yesterday. Their shadows went before them in the morning and followed them in the evening. He never stopped, and she never stopped. And as the sun was setting, he turned up another lane, and there they found their little daughter. It was all joy and comfort again till next morning, but then the third day journey commenced. But before he started, he gave her a comb, and told her that wherever she used it, pearls and diamonds would fall from her hair. Still, he had his full memory from sunset to sunrise. But from sunrise to sunset, he traveled on under the charm, and never threw his eye behind. This night they came to where the youngest baby was, and in the next morning, just before sunrise, the prince spoke to her for the last time. "Here, my poor wife," said he, "is a little hand reel with a gold thread that has no end, and the half of our marriage ring. If you can ever get to my bed and put your half ring to mine, I will recollect you. There is a wood yonder, and the moment I enter it, I will forget everything that ever happened between us, just as if I was born yesterday. Farewell, dear child and wife, forever." Just then the sun rose, and away he walked towards the wood. She saw it open before him and close after him. And when she came up, She could no more get in than she could break through a stone wall. She wrung her hands and shed tears, but then she recollected herself and cried out, "Would I charge you by my 3 magic gifts, the scissors, the comb, and the reel, to let me through?" And it opened, and she went along a walk till she came in sight of a palace and a lawn and a woodman's cottage in the edge of the forest, where it came nearest the palace. She went into this lodge and asked the woodsman and his wife to take her into their service. They were not willing at first, but when she told them she would ask no wages, and give them diamonds and pearls, and silk stuffs and gold thread whenever they wished for them, so they agreed to let her stay. It wasn't long till she heard how a young prince that was just arrived was living in the palace as the husband of the young mistress. Herself and her mother said that they were married 15 years before, and that he was charmed away from them ever since. He seldom stirred abroad, and everyone that saw him remarked how quiet and sorrowful he went about, like a person that was searching for something lost. The servants and conceited folk at the big house began to take notice of the beautiful young woman at the lodge, and to annoy her with their impudent advances. The head footman was the most tiresome, and at last she invited him to come take tea with her. Oh, how rejoiced he was, and how he bragged of it in all the servants' hall. Well, when the evening came, and the footman walked into the lodge, and was shown to her sitting room, for the lodge keeper and his wife stood in great awe of her, gave her 2 nice rooms to herself. Well, he sat down as stiff as a ramrod, and was talking in grand style about the great doings in the castle, while she was getting the tea and toast ready. "Oh," said she to him, "would you put your hand out of the window and cut me off a sprig or 2 of honeysuckle?" He got up with great glee, and put his hands and head, and said she, "By the virtue of my magic gifts, let a pair of horns spring out of your head, and serenade the lodge." Just as she wished, so it was done. They sprung from the front of each ear, and tore round the halls till they were met in the back. Oh, the poor wretch! And how he bawled and roared, and the servants that he was used to be boasting to were soon flocking from the castle, and grinning and huzzawing, and beating tunes to tongs and shovels and pans, and he cursing and swearing, and the eyes ready to start out of his head, and he was so black in the face, and kicking out his legs like mad. At last she pitied his case, and removed the charm, and the horns dropped down on the ground, and he would have killed her on the spot, only he was as weak as water, and his fellow servants came in and carried him up to the big house. Well, some way or another, the story came to the ears of the prince, and he strolled down that way. She had only the dress of a countrywoman on her as she sat sewing by the window, but that did not hide her beauty, and he was greatly puzzled and disturbed, for after he had a good look at her features, just as a body is perplexed to know whether something happened to him when he was young, or if he only dreamt about it. Well, the witch's daughter heard about it too, and she came to see the strange girl. And what she did, she found her doing, but cutting out a pattern of a gown from brown paper, and as she cut away, the paper became the richest silk she ever saw. The lady looked on with very covetous eyes, and says she, "Would you be satisfied to take for that scissors?" "I'll take nothing," says she, "but leave to spend one night in the prince's chamber, and I'll swear that we'll be as innocent as any crime next morning as we were in the evening." Well, the proud lady was fired up, and was going to say something dreadful, but the scissors kept on cutting, and the silk growing richer and richer each inch. So she agreed, and made her take a great oath to keep her promise. When night came on, she was let into her husband's chamber, and the door was locked. But when she came in a tremble, and sat by the bedside, the prince was in such a deep sleep that she couldn't awake him at all. She sung this verse to him, sighing and sobbing, and kept singing it in the night long, and it was all in vain. 4 long years I was married to thee, 3 sweet babies I bore to thee. Brown Bear of Norway, won't you turn to me? At the first dawn, the proud lady was in the chamber, and led her away, and the footman of the horns put out his tongue at her as she was quitting the palace. So there was no luck so far, but the next day the prince passed by again, and looked at her, and saluted her kindly, as a prince might a farmer's daughter, and passed on, and soon the witch's daughter came by, and found her combing her hair, and pearls and diamonds dripping from it. Well, another bargain was made, and the princess spent another night of sorrow, and she left the castle at daybreak, and the footman at his post enjoyed his revenge. The third day the prince went by, and stopped to talk with a strange woman. He asked her could he do anything to serve her, and she said that he might. She asked him did he ever wake at night. He said that he was rather wakeful than otherwise, but that during the last 2 nights he was listening to a sweet song in his dreams, and could not wake, and that the voice was one that he must have known and loved in some other world long ago. Says she, "Did you drink any sleepy posset either of these evenings before you went to bed?" "I did," said he. "The 2 evenings my wife gave me something to drink, but I don't know whether it was a sleepy posset or not." "Well, Prince, any drink this afternoon?" "Well, Prince," said she, "as you say, you wish to oblige me. Can you do it by not tasting any drink this afternoon?" "I will not." said he, and then he went on his walk. Well, the great lady was soon after the prince, and found the stranger using her hand reel and winding threads of gold with it, and the third bargain was made. The evening the prince was lying in his bed at twilight, and his mind was much disturbed, and the door opened, and in his princess walked, and down she sat by his side and sung, "For long years I was married to thee, 3 sweet babies I bore thee. Brown Bear of Norway, won't you turn to me?" "Brown Bear of Norway," said he, "I don't understand you." "Don't you remember, Prince, that I was your wedded wife for 4 years?" "I do not," said he, "but I am sure I wish it so." "Don't you remember our 3 babies that are still alive?" "Show me them. My mind is all a heap of confusion." "Look for the half of our marriage ring that hangs from your neck and fit it to this." He did so, and the same moment the charm was broken. His full memory came back to him, and he flung his arms round his wife's neck, and both burst into tears. Well, there was a great cry outside, and the castle walls were heard splitting and cracking. Everyone in the castle was alarmed, and made their way out. The prince and the princess went with the rest, and by the time all were safe on the lawn, down came the building, and made the ground tremble for miles around. No one ever saw the witch and her daughter afterwards. It was not long till the prince and the princess had their children with them, and then they set out for their own palace. The kings of Ireland and of Munster and Ulster and their wives soon came to visit them, and may every one that deserved it be as happy as the Brown Bear of Norway and his family. Our next story is called The Witch Hare, and it is attributed to Mr. and Mrs. C.S. Hall. I was out thracking hares myself, and I seen a fine puss of things hopping in the moonlight, and whacking her ears about, up now, now down, and winking her great eyes, and "Here goes," says I, and the thing was so close to me that she turned round and looked at me, and then bounced back, as well as to say, "Do your worst." And so I less grain in life of blessed powder left, and I put it in the gun, and bang at her. My jewel, the scritch she gave, would frighten a regiment, and like a mist came betwixt me and her, and I had seen her no more. But when the mist went off, I saw blood on the spot where she had been, and I followed its track, and it led me, whisper, right up to Katie McShane's door. And when I was at the threshold, I heard a murmuring within, a great murmuring and groaning, and I opened the door, and there she was herself, sitting quite content in the shape of a woman, and the black cat that was sitting up by her rose its back and spat at me. But I went on, never heeding, and asked the old how she was and what ailed her. "Nothing," said she. "What's that on the floor?" said I. "Oh," says she, "I was cutting a billet of wood," she says, "with the reaping hook," she says, "and I've wounded myself in the leg," says she, "and that's drops of my precious blood," she says. Quite a short little one. Our next story is called Bewitched Butter, Queen's Country, attributed to Dublin University Magazine, 1839. About the commencement of the last century, there lived in the vicinity of the once famous village of Agove, a beautiful and romantic village in Queen's Country, and a wealthy farmer named Brian Coxtian. This man kept an extensive dairy and a great many milk cows, and every year made considerable sums of sale of milk and butter. The luxuriance of the pasture lands in this neighborhood had always been proverbial, and consequently Brian's cows were the finest and most productive in the country, and his milk and butter were the richest and the sweetest, and brought the highest price at every market at which he offered those articles for sale. Things continued to go on thusly prosperously with Brian Coxton, when one season, all at once, he found his cattle declining in appearance, and his dairy almost entirely profitless. Brian, at first, attributed this to the change in the weather, and some for cause, but soon found or fancied reasons to assign it to a far different source. The cows, without any visible disorder, daily declined, and were scarcely able to crawl about on their pastures. Many of them, instead of milk, gave nothing but blood, and the scanty quantity of milk which came out of them and continued to supply was so bitter that even the pigs would not drink it, whilst the butter which it produced was of such bad quality and stunk so horribly that the very dogs would not eat it. Brian applied for remedies to all the quacks and fairy women in the country, but in vain. Many of the impostors declared that the mysterious malady in his cattle went beyond their skill, whilst others, though they found no difficulty in tracing it to superhuman agency, declared that they had no control in the matter, as the charm was under the influence of which his property was made away with, was too powerful to be dissolved by anything less than the special interposition of divine providence. The poor farmer became almost distracted. He saw ruin staring at him in the face. Yet what was he to do? Sell his cattle and purchase others? No, that was out of the question, as they looked so miserable and emaciated that no one would even take them as a present, whilst it was also impossible to sell at a butcher, as the flesh of one which he had killed for his own family was as black as coal and stunk like any putrid carrion. The unfortunate man was thus completely bewildered. He knew not what to do. He became moody and stupid. His sleep forsook him by night, and by all day he wandered about the fields amongst his fairy-stricken cattle like a maniac. Welcome in, Game Crazy. Affairs continued in this plight when one very sultry evening, in the latter days of July, Brian's wife was sitting at her own door, spinning at her wheel, in the very gloomy and agitated state of mind. Happening to look down the narrow green lane which led from the high road to her cabin, she espied a little old woman barefoot, and enveloped in an old scarlet cloak, approaching slowly, with the aid of a crutch which she carried in one hand, and a cane or walking stick in the other. The farmer's wife felt glad to seeing an odd-looking stranger. She smiled, and yet she knew not why, as she neared the house. A vague and indefinable feeling of pleasure crowded on her imagination, and as the old woman gained the threshold, she bade her welcome, with a warmth which plainly told that her lips gave utterance to the genuine feelings of her heart. God bless this good house and all belongings to it, said the stranger as she entered. God save you kindly, and you are welcome, whoever you are, replied Mrs. Costin. I thought so, said the old woman with a significant grin. I thought so, or I wouldn't trouble you. The farmer's wife ran and placed a chair near the fire for the stranger, but she refused and sat on the ground where Miss C had been spinning. The missus had now time to survey the old hag's person minutely. She appeared of great age. Her countenance was extremely ugly and repulsive. Her skin was rough and deeply enfrowned, as if from long exposures to some tropical climate. Her long gray hair fell in matted elf locks from beneath a white linen skull cap. Her eyes were bleared, bloodshot, and obliquely set into their sockets, and her voice was a croaking, tumultuous, and at times partially inarticulate. As she squatted upon the floor, she looked round the house with an inquisitive gaze. She peered pryingly from one corner to another, with an earnestness of look, as if she had the facility, like an Argonaut of old, to see through the very depths of the earth, whilst Miss C kept watching her motions with mingled feelings of curiosity, awe, and pleasure. Mrs., said the old woman, at length breaking silence, I am dry with the heat of the day. Could you give me a drink? Alas, replied the farmer's wife, I have no drink to offer you except water, else you would have no occasion to ask me for it. Are you not the owner of the cattle I see yonder? said the old hag, with a tone of voice and manner of justification which plainly indicated her foreknowledge of the fact. Mrs. C. replied in an affirmative, and briefly related to her every circumstance connected with the affair, whilst the old woman still remained silent, but shook her grey head repeatedly, and still continued gazing about the house, with an air of importance and self-sufficiency. When Mrs. C. ended, the old hag remained a while as if she was in a deep reverie. At length she said, "Have you any milk in the house?" "I have," replied the other. "Show me some of it." She filled a jug from the vessel and handed it to the old Sibyl, who smelled it and then tasted it, and spat out what she had taken on the floor. "Where is your husband?" she asked. "Out in the fields," was the reply. "I must see him." A messenger was dispatched for Brian, who shortly after made his appearance. "Neighbor," said the stranger, "your wife informs me that your cattle are going against you this season." "She informs you right," says Brian. "And why have you not sought a cure?" "A cure?" re-echoed the man. "Why, woman, I sought cures until I was heartbroken, and all in vain. They get worse every day." "What will you give me if I cure them for you?" "Anything in our power," replied Brian and his wife, both speaking joyfully and with a breath. "All I will ask of you is a silver 6pence, and that you will do everything which I bid you," said she. So the farmer and his wife seemed astonished at the moderation of her demand. They offered her a large sum of money. "No," said she, "I don't want your money. I am no cheat, and I would not even take 6pence. But I can do nothing till I handle some of your silver." The 6pence was immediately given to her, and the most implicit obedience promised to her injunctions by both Brian and his wife, who already began to regard the old beldame as their tutelary angel. The hag pulled off a black silk ribbon or fillet which encircled her head inside her cap, and gave it to Brian, saying, "Go now, and the first cow you touch with this ribbon, turn her into the yard, but be sure do not touch the second, nor speak a word until you return. Be also careful not to let the ribbon touch the ground, for if you do, it is all over." Brian took the talismanic ribbon and soon returned, driving a red cow before him. The old hag went out and, approaching the cow, commenced pulling hairs out of her tail, at the same time singing some verses in the Irish language in a low, wild, and unconnected strain. The cow appeared restive and uneasy, but the old witch still continued her mysterious chant until she had the 9th hair extracted. Then she ordered the cow to be drove back to her pasture, and again entered the house. "Go now," said she to the woman, "and bring me some milk from every cow in your possession." She went, and soon returned with a large pail filled with a frightful-looking mixture of milk, blood, and corrupted matter. The old woman got it into the churn and made preparations for churning. "Now," said she, "you both must churn. Make fast the doors and windows. Let there be no light but from the fire. Do not open your lips until I desire you. And by observing my directions, I make no doubt, but ere the sun goes down, you will find out the infernal villain who is robbing you." Brian secured the doors and windows and commenced churning. The old sorceress sat down by a blazing fire, which had been specially lighted for the occasion, and commenced singing the same wild song which she had sung at the pulling of the cow hairs. And after a little time she cast one of the 9 hairs into the fire, still singing her mysterious strain, and watching with intense interest the witching process. A loud cry, as if from a female in distance, was now heard approaching the house. The old woman discontinued her incantations and listened intently. The crying voice opened the door. "Open the door quickly," shouted the charmer. Brian unbarred the door, and all 3 rushed out into the yard. When they heard the same cry down the boreen, but could see nothing. "It is all over," shouted the old witch. "Something has gone amiss, and our charm for the present is ineffectual." They now turned quite crestfallen, when, as they entered the door, the Sibyl cast her eyes downward, and perceiving a piece of horseshoe nailed to the threshold, a preservative against the influence of the fairies, she vociferated, "Here I have it. No wonder our charm was abortive. The person that was crying abroad is the villain who has your cattle bewitched. I brought her to the house, but she was not able to come to the door on account of that horseshoe. Remove it instantly, and we will try our luck again." Brian removed the horseshoe from the doorway, and by the hag's directions placed it on the floor under the churn, having previously reddened it with the fire. They again resumed their manual operations. Brian and his wife began to churn, and the witch again to sing her strange verses, and her casting her cow hairs into the fire until she had them all nearly exhausted. Her countenance now began to exhibit evident traces of vexation and disappointment. She got quite pale, her teeth gnashed, and her hand trembled as she cast the 9th and last hair into the fire. Her person exhibited more the appearance of a female demon than a human being. Once more the cry was heard, and an aged red-haired woman, red-haired people being thought to possess magic power, was seen approaching the house quickly. "Ho ho!" roared the sorceress. "I knew it would be so. My charm has exceeded my expectation."
years of using hair care
are
products.
realized. And here she comes, the villain who has destroyed you. What are we to do now? Asked Brian. Say nothing to her, said the hag. Give her whatever she demands, and leave the rest to me. The woman advanced screeching vehemently, and Brian went out to meet her. She was a neighbor, and she said that one of her best cows was drowning in a pool of water, that there was no one at home but herself, and she implored Brian to go rescue the cow from destruction. Brian accompanied her without hesitation. Then, having rescued the cow from her perilous situation, was back again within a quarter hour. It was now sunset, and Miss C set about preparing supper. During supper, they reverted to the singular transactions of the day. The old witch uttered many a fiendish language laugh at the success of her incantations, and inquired who was the woman whom they had so curiously discovered. Brian satisfied her in every particular. She was the wife of a neighboring farmer. Her name was Rachel Higgins, and she had been long suspected to be on familiar terms with spirits of darkness. She had 5 or 6 cows, but it was observed by her sapient neighbors that she sold more butter every year than other farmers' wives who had 20. Brian had, from the commencement of the decline of his cattle, suspected her for being the aggressor, but as he had no proof, he held his peace. Well, said the old beldame, with a grim smile, it is not enough that we have merely discovered the robber. All is in vain if we do not take steps to punish her for her past, as well as to prevent her inroads in the future. And how will that be done? Asked Brian. I will tell you, as soon as the hour is 12 o'clock tonight. Do you go to the pasture and take a couple of swift running dogs with you. Conceal yourself in some place convenient to the cattle. Watch them carefully, and if you see anything, whether man or beast, approach the cows, set on the dogs, and if possible, make them draw the blood of the intruder. They all will be accomplished. If nothing approaches before sunrise, you may return and we will try something else. Convenient there lived the cowherd of a neighboring squire. He was a hardy, courageous young man, and always kept a pair of very ferocious bulldogs. To him Brian applied for assistance, and he cheerfully agreed to accompany him, and moreover proposed to fetch a couple of his master's best greyhounds, as his own dogs, although extremely fierce and bloodthirsty, could not be relied on for swiftness. He promised Brian to be with him before 12 o'clock, and they parted. Brian did not seek sleep that night. He sat up anxiously, awaiting the midnight hour. It arrived at last, and his friend the herdsman true to his promise, came at the time appointed. After some further admontions from the Collach, they departed. Having arrived at the field, they consulted as to the best position they could choose to conceal. At last, they pitched on a small brake of fern, situated at the extremity of the field, adjacent to a boundary ditch, which was thickly studded with large old white thorn bushes. Here they crouched themselves and made the dogs, 4 in number, lie down beside them, eagerly expecting the appearance of their as yet unknown and mysterious visitor. Here Brian and his comrade continued a considerable time in nervous anxiety. Still nothing approached, and it became manifest that morning was at hand. They were beginning to grow impatient, and were talking of returning home, when on the sudden they heard a rushing sound behind them, as if proceeding from something endeavoring to force a passage through the thick hedge in the rear. They looked in that direction, and judge of their astonishment when they perceived a large hare in the act of springing from the ditch and leaping on the ground quite near them. They were now convinced that this was the object of which they had so impatiently inspected, and they were resolved to watch her motions narrowly. After arriving to the ground, she remained motionless for a few moments, looking around her sharply. She then began to skip and jump in a playful manner, now advancing at a smart pace towards the cows, and again retreating perceptibly, but still drawing nearer and nearer each sally. At length she advanced up to the next cow and sucked her for a moment, then on the next, and so respectively to every cow on the field. The cows all the time lowing loudly and appearing extremely frightened and agitated. Brian, from the moment the hare commenced sucking on the thirst, was with difficulty restraining from attacking her, but his more sagacious companion suggested to him that it was better to wait until she would have done, as she would then be much heavier. For being now done sucking them all, her belly appeared enormously distended, and she made her exit slowly and apparently with difficulty. She advanced towards the hedge where she had entered, and as she arrived just as the clump of ferns where her foes were crouched, they started up with a fierce yell and hallowed the dogs upon her path. The hare started off at a brisk pace, squirting up the milk she had sucked from her mouth and nostrils, and the dogs making after her rapidly. Rachel Higgins' cabin appeared through the gray of the twilight morning at a little distance, and it was evident that Puss seemed bent on gaining it, although she made considerable circuit through the fields in the rear. Brian and his comrade, however, had their thoughts, and made towards the cabin by the shortest route, and had just arrived as the hare came up, panting and almost exhausted, and the dogs at her very scrut. She ran around the house, evidently confused and disappointed at the presence of the men, but at length made for the door. In the bottom of the door was a small, semicircular aperture, resembling those cut into fowl house doors for the ingress and egress of poultry. To gain this hole, Passanel made a last and desperate effort, and had succeeding in forcing her head and shoulders through it, when the foremost of the dogs made a spring and seized her violently by the haunch. She uttered a loud and piercing scream, and struggled desperately to free herself from his grip, and at last succeeded, but not until she left a piece of her rump in his teeth. The men now burst open the door. A bright turf fire blazed on the hearth, and the whole floor was streaming with blood. No hair, however, could be found, and the men were more than ever convinced that it was old Rachel who had, by the assistance of some devil, assumed the form of the hare, and they now determined to have her if she were over the earth. They entered the bedroom and heard some smothered groaning, as if proceeding from someone in extreme agony. They went to the corner of the room from whence the moans proceeded, and there, beneath a bundle of freshly cut rushes, found the form of Rachel Higgins, writhing in the most excruciating agony, and almost smothered in a pool of blood. The men were astounded. They addressed the wretched old woman, but she either could not or would not answer them. Her wound still bled copiously. Her tortures appeared to increase, and it was evident that she was dying. The aroused family thronged around her with cries and lamentations. She did not seem to heed them. She got worse and worse, and her piercing yells fell away to the ears of bystanders. At length she expired, and her corpse exhibited the most appalling spectacle, even before the spirit had well departed. Brian and his friend returned home. The old hag had been previously aware of the fate of Rachel Higgins, but it was not known by what means she acquired her supernatural knowledge. She was delighted at the issue of her mysterious operations. Brian pressed her much to accept of some remunerations for her services, but she utterly rejected such proposals. She remained a few days at his house, and at length took her leave and departed, no one knew whither. Old Rachel's remains were interred that night in the neighboring churchyard. Her fate soon became generally known, and her family, ashamed to remain in their native village, disposed of their property and quitted the country forever. The story, however, is still fresh in the memory of the surrounding villagers, and often, it is said, amidst the gray haze of summer twilight, may the ghost of Rachel Higgins, in the form of a hare, be seen scuttling over her favorite and well-remembered haunts. And that, my dears, concludes today's reading hour. I thank you all so much for joining me today, and I do hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your days. But until the next time, my dears, ta-ta, and fare thee well. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you like what you saw here, I ask that you leave a like, comment, subscribe, and until we next meet, my dears, I do hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And until then, ta-ta and farewell.